Okay guys, this video is going to have a look at how you would go about using alpha maps with your textures to simulate more kind of complex effects. So this example, we're going to have a look at kind of creating a kind of hanging banner like this. You could approach this modeling this kind of exactly how it actually kind of looks polygonal wise, vertices here, but there's no need to kind of have that level of complexity with this kind of model. We can have a simple plane that we can apply a texture to, and we kind of get the detail, this sort of detail within the actual texture itself, rather than kind of modeling it in. So we're going to use a technique called alpha mapping to actually kind of simulate this effect. It's quite a straightforward approach. Alpha maps work great as well. There's a lot that you can kind of simulate, grass, foliage, banners, all that sort of stuff. So we're going to have a look at how you could kind of go about doing this using Photoshop to create your alpha map. You can use other applications, Paint, probably not Paint, Paint Tool Sci, Critter, anything like that. Any kind of layer-based graphics program is probably fine, but I use Photoshop for this. So I'm just going to kind of delete this out, and we'll make this again from scratch. So I've obviously just got a very simple kind of pole and crossbar. We're going to start by just creating a plane for this. So in our create menu, just going to create a plane, kind of try and rough out the dimensions. Don't worry, we can always kind of change them later on. So we're just going to move this up and just rotate this. And I've got my angle snap set, just so I can rotate this at set degrees. If that's something that you want to do, you can just press this little magnet option at the top here, or the keyboard shortcut is A on the keyboard. So just going to make sure this is all lined up nicely. So I'm just going to center it off with the y-axis, and let's just get this lined up on the side view. There we go. So get this all nicely lined up like that. There we go. So if I have a look at the on the modify panel, just some of the properties of this parametric plane. At the minute, its length segments and width segments are set to 1. Now this is because I already created a plane before and I changed these. By default, you'll get 4x4. I'm actually just going to put these back up to 4x4, just because I'll want to perhaps maybe change kind of maybe give it creases or crumples, or maybe kind of change some of the vertices around, just to kind of give it a little bit more life rather than just hanging down straight. So the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to have a look at unwrapping the UVs for this object. So at the minute it's still a parametric plane. I'm just going to right click and turn it into an editable poly. I usually find that it's better to kind of include this step rather than just adding the unwrap UV. We're going to have to, well, we're going to come back and kind of edit this shape on a component level anyway, so we might as well just kind of make it editable now. So in our modifier drop down list, we're just going to select unwrap UVWs, and I'm just going to open up the UV editor. So the UV editor, because this is a plane, the entire UVs are nicely mapped to fill out the entire UV space, which is very efficient. I'm actually going to scale my UV coordinates down. This is mainly because at the minute, because the actual shape of the geometry is not perfectly square, the texture will actually be distorted on this object. And a nice way I can check is just in my UV editor here. It says checker pattern checker in the top corner. If I just click this drop down menu and then just click it again, you'll see that it gives you a preview of your checkerboard pattern on your actual object. And as you can see, the checkerboard pattern, the squares are longer, higher up, rather than side to side, they're kind of squished up. So this is going to result basically in us having to kind of counteract this effect by distorting the texture into the UV space and then kind of squashing it back out of the model. That's one way you can approach it. What I'm actually going to do is just edit my UVs just to kind of get rid of the distortion directly on the mesh. And what that will result in though is some wasted UV space within my actual coordinates. It's not really that much of a problem, but when you want to be kind of super efficient, you want to kind of make the best use of your UV space as you can. For this example, it's not really that much of an issue. So let's have a look at how we can get the UV space set up. So the first thing that I want to do is have a look at how the UVs are actually arranged. Now, even though my plane this technically is the top and this is the bottom, that is not necessarily reflected in how the UVs are set up. And the easiest way to check is just make sure that you're on UV points mode, UV vertex mode, and just select one of the points. So you can see visually here, if I select this point, the top left, it actually is reflected as the top right, which would lead me to believe that my UVs are actually rotated by 90 degrees. So just to kind of double check to see which way things are oriented, I'm going to say that this bottom left point here is the top left point here. Just select that and you can see that that is correct. So just to kind of get ourselves started, I'm just going to select all of the UV points. I'm just going to use the rotate mode tool and I'm just going to click and drag, and because I've got my angle snap on, I'm going to get nicely snapped rotations even within the UV coordinates as well. So now if I select the top left, that now reflects the top left. If I select the top right, that now selects the top right. So that's excellent. So in terms of counteracting this distortion, at the minute it's distorted horizontally because basically the outside points are stretched right to the edge of the UV space, but I have a shape that is not a perfect square. So a simple fix is just going to be to select all of the points, and we're going to use the scale mode, but we're not going to use the default scale. At the minute it's set to uniform scale, so you can just see these little arrows pointing out into each corner. We're just going to click and hold, and I just want to select the horizontal scale only. So we'll just get the arrows pointing out to either side. And to be able to scale this, just need to hover over one of my points and just click and drag, and you'll see in the viewport that I get a nice kind of even square. And that's what we're kind of aiming for. So we've now got non-distorted UV coordinates, but if I just select all of my UV space there, I've actually probably wasted almost 50% of the actual UV space. Now, in proper applications, this would be pretty bad, but for the purpose of this, it's not really the end of the world. As I said before, if you wanted to maximize the UV space for efficiency, what you'd have to do is actually distort your texture or your image within Photoshop or whatever you're using to put your texture together, and that would be kind of counteracted when it would be applied to the material. So I've got this all set up. I just need to render out a UV template, so I'm just going to go to Tools and Render UV Template, and here is where I can set up my actual width and height dimensions for the resulting texture. I'm just going to leave it at 1024. It's a decent size, so I'm just going to say Render UV Template, and we're going to get the Render Map window. This hasn't actually saved the image yet. We do need to actually save it now. So top left corner, Save Image. And depending on how you've set up your project folder, mine's set up to a folder on my desktop, so all of my image assets go into the Images folder within the Scene Assets. You can see my already prepared images there. For this, I'm just going to create a new file, which will be my actual UV coordinates. So I'm just going to call this one banner UV. And for your type, I'm just going to save it as a TIF image, mainly because TIF images are kind of the best format you can pick quality-wise, but they also support layers, which means we don't have to resort to kind of saving it as a Photoshop document. The layer information is preserved in a TIF image. So we'll always kind of have a TIF image master version of our textures, which we'll always come back to edit. We'll save off kind of individual flattened copies to be used within 3ds Max or your game engine. So we're just going to save this as a TIF image, banner UV, just hit save, and it's going to ask me how do I actually want to save this image. Now our color bit depth is fine, we don't want any compression, but our dots per inch, at the minute it's set to 300. Now the simplest rule, I'm not going to kind of go into explaining what this dots per inch is. The simple explanation or the simple rule is if you want to print out an image, you would set it to 300 generally, because that's kind of better quality for printing. For screen, you want to set it to 72. Now, because we're developing an asset for a game, we're not printing this out, we're going to be using it solely for screen, so we're going to make sure that it's set to 72. I'm just going to say OK, and that's done. So I can close the image window, I can close my UV window, and I can jump over into Photoshop now. So let's just open up our UV window, our UV template. So this is our UV template. So we need to make sure that our texture fits within these green borders. These green borders signify the edges of the UV shell. Now obviously with more complex polygonal objects you might have numerous shells dotted around and arranged within your UV space. Now because we're only essentially working with one plane, the UV shell itself is quite simple. It's just our 16 polygons that we created, our 4x4 plane. So the first thing we need to do to actually start working with this, just in your layer panel over on the right hand side, we've got our background layer. We're just going to double click on the little padlock, and that will open up. It will basically convert our layer to a layer that we can actually edit and work with. Now what we're going to do is, because it's black at the minute with white lines, we're actually going to invert this image just so it's a little bit easier to use. So you can go to edits and oh god, where is this image, adjustments and invert. So you can just press that, or you can obviously just use the keyboard shortcut Control-I, and that will invert our image. So now we have a white background with black lines, which is going to make it a little bit easier. We also want to set the blend mode of this layer to multiply. Now your blend modes are just this little drop down here, just at the top of your layer panel. Your blend modes basically tell Photoshop how you want layers to kind of react with one another. So we're going to set ours to multiply. The reason being is that multiply basically knocks out all of the light colors, all of the whites, and leaves the black where it is. So this is going to be helpful for us to see through our UV layer and use it kind of as a template, and then when we actually save out our image, we can just hide our UV layer. So I'm just going to lock layer 0 now, that's set to multiply, and we're going to create a new layer. So new layer just at the bottom of your layer panel, and I'm just going to drag this underneath layer 0 because layer 0 is on top, it's multiplying through, so we'll be able to see everything underneath. So I'm just going to press Control V. This is just an image I got off the internet. Obviously, for the purpose of this tutorial, it was easy to do this. I would expect you guys to use your own. I think actually for this we'll use this one. It looks a little bit more interesting. So I'm just going to select that, Control Shift and I, just to invert my selection, and then delete, and then Control D just to deselect. So this image was obviously very small. I'm just going to rescale it up. This is probably a great example to show you why you shouldn't just be content with using images from the internet. Once we blow this up, you'll see that the quality is going to be absolutely atrocious. So we are going to have to make a few adjustments as well. There we go. So I'm just going to center this up, And I'm just going to make sure as well that, let's have a look. Let's have a look. Just pop my UV to the top as well. So we'll have a bit of wasted UV space down here. That's fine. This is generally because I picked an image off the internet. If you were generating your own image, you would obviously design it to fill the UV space. But we can see there it's pretty terrible quality. It doesn't matter too much for the purpose of this exercise. But that's essentially it for creating the diffuse or the color texture for our object. So if we're going to save this off, we're just going to hide layer 0 by just pressing the little eye icon. And we can go into File, and we're going to go to Save As. And let's save it as a TGA, which is generally a generally kind of accepted image format for games engines. So this is going to be banner DIF for diffuse. It's really up to you how you use naming conventions. I like to use kind of abbreviated names for my different texture maps. So DIF for diffuse, ALP for alpha, NRM for normal, etc., etc. But again, it's up to you how you name these, as long as you have a system to kind of keep things kind of organized. So I'm just going to press save and hit OK. If I jump back over into 3ds Max, we're just going to press M on our keyboard to get our material. And I've already got a material set up, a standard material. So what I'm going to do is just delete all of that and just create it from scratch. So to create a material, right click, materials, and standard. And from our diffuse color node, we just want to click and drag with our left mouse button, and we want to add a bitmap in. Now, again, depending on how you set up your project folder, you might have to do a little bit of navigating. This is one of the benefits of using your project folder set up properly, because basically any kind of image dialogues will point directly to our scene assets images folder, so we don't have to kind of do a lot of hunting around. So I'm just going to load in that banner DIF TGA. That's going to load in, and to apply this to our model, we just need to make sure that we have our model selected, which we do, and make sure our material is selected by just pressing or clicking on this little blue area here in the material. If it's not selected, it will look like this. With it selected, you'll see the text is a little bit bolder, it goes white. And to apply it to the object, we're just going to press this button here, assign material to selection. Kind of looks like a little checkerboard with a green cube. And to actually see the material in the viewport, we're just going to press this little button here, little checkerboard pattern with kind of a candle icon on it. So just press on that, and there we go. We've got our banner on, but obviously it's not cut out. How we had it set up within Photoshop, we obviously had white areas around the banner. So we're going to jump back into Photoshop and look at how we can create an alpha map to cut this out. So back in Photoshop, what we're going to do is we need to do a little bit of processing on the image that we have here already. Now the easiest way, basically what we're going to start to do is just kind of cut out the white that is already here, and the easiest way to do that is to use your Magic Wand tool. So normally it's W on your keyboard. You might have to, on the left hand side, just long click and select Magic Wand tool. It might sometimes default to Quick Selection tool, and because this image is being resized, there's probably going to be a lot of weird artifacts around the edges where the transition between the white and the green is. So if that is the case, you can always up your tolerance to something a bit higher. So it's normally set to 5. I set mine to about 30. And if we click, we can see there we get a nice cut all the way around, nice selection all the way around. So we're going to delete that off on our layer. So we're left with a nice transparent background around the image. And I think what we'll do is, just to make this a little bit more interesting, we'll actually just maybe cut some little bits out or make some little tears. So I'm just going to zoom in. So Control and plus and you can see how terrible the quality is once you've zoomed in. And I'm just going to use my one of my lasso tools, and what we're going to do is just click and drag, maybe to add a couple of kind of little tears in here. So we want some nice rough edges on this side. Don't worry if it's not perfect. There we go. So back to the beginning. So we've got our selection there, and I'm just going to hit delete, just so we get some nice kind of rough kind of edges there as well. So it's important to do this before we process the alpha as well, just kind of make it a little bit distressed. So it might be, you might want to just do like a, let's do a little rip in the flag here as well. My mouse is a little bit shaky, so it's not perfect, but there we go. So it almost looks like a bear or something's kind of ragged through it. Okay, so I'm not going to go to town on this too much, but we now do have kind of a more interesting profile, interesting silhouette to this flag. So actually processing this into an alpha map is very simple. We will need to create another layer, so we're just going to press to create another layer, and we want to make sure this is underneath our flag layer. Now I haven't been following my own advice here. I normally make sure all my layers are correctly labeled, but again, because this is quite a simple file, I'm not going to kind of do that. But once you start kind of having, you know, documents of 60-70 layers in, you want to make sure that you know what every layer is. So on layer 2, we just need to make a black background. Now to change your color is just these two color options here on the left hand side. So I'm just going to select the top box. Mine was already set to black, but obviously you want to make sure that it is completely black, and we want to make sure because that it is fully black, all of these values here should be 0. The hue is obviously at the maximum. The hash code is set to 6 zeros, so we know there that this is pure black. So we're going to press OK. And with layer 2 selected, we're just going to press Control and backspace. So that's for the background color, Alt and backspace. Now, because of the quality of this image, you can see that we do have some kind of some ghosting around the edges there. In fact, actually, let's have a look at getting rid of that. It should be fairly straightforward. What we're going to do is we're going to select layer 1. We're going to hold down Control on our keyboard and just click on the thumbnail for layer 1. You should see what that does is it selects all around layer 1. And you can see it even selects the parts that are outside of the texture. So obviously when I've deleted areas, there was still a little bit remaining at the top there. What we're going to do is we're going to, in the top left here, we've got a feather option, which is set to 0 at the minute. We're just going to feather this by 5. Now what this is going to do is, it's going to add kind of almost like a gradiated selection between around the edges of our actual selected object. So 5 pixel feather. We're going to then invert our selection again. So Control, Shift, and I on the keyboard. And if we just press delete, well, I should have deleted some. No, it hasn't worked. Okay. Let's just zoom out again. We might have to, if we just select the layer again, we might have to just go and actually manually modify the selection. So the select menu on the top, modify and feather, and let's just set this to, let's set it to 5 pixels. In fact, let's set it to 10 pixels and just say OK. Now we can Control, Shift, and I to invert the selection and just press delete. And we can see that that has kind of sort of got rid of our issue. So if we just delete again, Control S, Control D, there we go. So that's a lot better. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better. So we've now got rid of the ghosting around the edges. So the last thing to do is just to make the flag completely white. Now, the reason we're doing this is the way that alpha maps work is anything that is completely black in the alpha map will be completely transparent. So it will knock out any kind of color value there. It will apply full alpha. Anything that is white is fully opaque, so it will retain 100% of your color values. Now you can play around with this principle by kind of implementing little tricks. So obviously you've got your black and white as kind of polar opposites. If you want to have textures that are partially translucent, you can actually use a grey color to kind of simulate translucency as well. So you could use this to kind of create stained glass windows or other kind of glass objects. So anything that is really transparent, you could use that. It's not going to be as perfect as creating a complete glass shader within your games engine, but it might be useful for kind of for smaller kind of decals that need to be kind of semi-translucent. For our flag though, we want to make sure that it is all completely white. Now there's a couple of ways you can do this, but the way I'm going to show you, I think it's probably a better way because it's what we refer to as a non-destructive process. Some of the other methods that you might see are referred to as destructive processes because the only way to undo them is to obviously use your Control-Z, whereas our non-destructive method allows you to kind of turn on and off and play around and change properties without actually destroying any of the original data. So to do this, we're just going to add what we call an adjustment layer to our document. Now adjustment layers are just located here in the bottom right. You see you've got a series of icons along the bottom. The adjustment layers are the one that kind of looks like a half full circle, so a black and white circle. So we're going to click on this, and the one that we're going to use is a hue and saturation. So when you add an adjustment layer, you'll see that it automatically opens up your properties. And at the minute, nothing's happened because we haven't actually changed any of the values within our hue and saturation adjustment layer. What we want to do is just ramp up the lightness to full. Now, what you're going to see happen here is that when I ramp this up, the entire document is going to go white. And this is because by default, adjustment layers affect all of the layers below it, which is, in our case, well, it might be useful in most cases, but in our case, that's not very useful at all. What we can do, though, is we can tell Photoshop that we want to set the adjustment layer to only affect the layer below where the adjustment layer is in the layer stack. So to do that, we're just going to hover our cursor halfway between the hue and saturation layer and layer 1, and we're just going to hold Alt on the keyboard, and you'll see that your cursor now changes to a little square with a black arrow. If we click that, we'll now see that we get a little arrow to the left on the hue and saturation layer, and you'll also be able to see within your document that we now have on the flag it's only the flag itself which is white. We do have some grey areas around here. This is more to do with when we used our feather. So this might result in some weird transparency issues around the outside, but it's nothing that can't be fixed fairly easily. So that's looking pretty good for the alpha map. We're going to go on File and Save As, and we're going to save this again as a TGA file, and we're going to just call this one ALP for alpha, and we're just going to hit save. So we're going to say OK again, and if we jump back into 3ds Max, we're now just going to add to our material we've already created an alpha map. So we're going to do this by dragging off from the opacity node. So the opacity handles obviously how opaque or translucent the object is, and it's something that you can kind of procedurally control, or you can chuck in a black and white image to kind of specify. So I'm just going to select the banner ALP TGA. We're just going to say open, and you'll see once that loads in, we now have our updated banner within our scene, and you can see that we've got the holes in there as well. We've got our nice cutout going on as well. It looks pretty good. Once we're happy with that, once we're happy with what the texture looks like, in our modifier stack, we can just right click on Unwrap UVW, just say Collapse All, and just say yes. That will collapse everything back down to an editable poly. So essentially our UV coordinates are baked in to the object. this will now allow us to kind of edit our editable poly again. So let's say we want our flag to kind of look a little bit more crumpled, a little bit more give it a bit more life. So we can select some of these vertices and we can kind of have a play around. So let's have a look. There we go. So let's just say that the wind is blowing it almost. Here we go. And then we can bring this out a little bit, and these ones here. There we go. So we deselect everything, and I've just got my edged faces on, so I'm just going to turn edged faces off, and there we have it. We have a nice flag. Looks quite realistic. We've got nice detailed edges. Yeah, it looks pretty good. So yeah, in this video we've covered how to create our UVs, how to sort our UVs out, how to create our diffuse texture, and how to create our alpha texture.